Blood stained her fragile hands. Cold winter wind bit through torn linen. She cradled dying beasts while arrogant royals slept upstairs. Ancient secrets hid within damp hay, waiting for dawn. He stood watching, silent, a shadow bearing an invisible crown, discovering salvation where only sickness and despair truly thrived. Incredible. The kingdom of Oakhaven was dying from the inside out, consumed by a plague that targeted not the human frailties of its people, but the ancient, primal blood of its ruling class. They called it the Crimson Blight. It struck the Lycan nobility without warning, locking them in their wolf forms, rotting their flesh, and driving them into a fevered, rabid madness. At the heart of this decaying empire was King Liam of House Vane, a newly crowned Alpha King. Liam was known for his ruthless pragmatism on the battlefield and a cold, impenetrable demeanor at court. But behind the iron-wrought gates of the High Keep, Liam was a king watching his family and his most loyal generals deteriorate into feral monsters. Unable to bear the sight of his closest confidants being slaughtered to prevent the spread, Liam ordered the afflicted to be quarantined in the lowest levels of the royal beast. Keep the sprawling, cavernous stone stables beneath the castle. It was here, amidst the overwhelming stench of copper, infection, and wet fur, that Alice found her life's grim purpose. Alice was a nameless ghost in the castle's hierarchy. Officially, she was a scullery maid and the bastard daughter of a disgraced apothecary, Lord Reginald Sterling, who had been exiled years prior for dabbling in forbidden herbalism. Unofficially, Alice possessed a terrifying suppressed gift. She was a moon weaver, a bloodline thought to have been eradicated centuries ago. Her touch could draw out fever, and her blood sang with the old magic of the earth. The castle was freezing, but the stables, heated by the sheer mass of the suffering wolves, offered a damp, oppressive warmth. Every night, after the castle slept, Alice would sneak past the drunken guards and slip into the quarantine zone. The sight was enough to break the hardest of hearts. These were not mere animals. These were dukes, ladies, and fierce warriors. There lay Lady Beatrice of the Northern Reaches, once renowned for her golden hair, now a matted, shivering blonde wolf hacking up black blood. Beside her was old Hemlock, Liam's former mentor, missing half his fur and whining in blind agony. Alice did not fear them, even when their yellow eyes rolled back and they snapped their jaws at the empty air. She moved among the stalls with a quiet, fearless grace. She brought poultices of crushed feverfew, sweetbriar, and bone marrow, applying them to festering wounds. More importantly, she gave them what the frightened stable masters would not touch. She would lay in the blood-stained straw, pulling the massive, fever-hot heads of the dying wolves into her lap, humming ancient lullabies her mother had taught her. And miraculously, under her hands, the Crimson Blight seemed to stall. The rabid aggression melted into a pained but peaceful docility. It was on the morning of the winter solstice that the delicate secrecy of Alice's nocturnal life was shattered. King Liam had not slept in 4 days. The pressure from the High Council, led by the ambitious Councillor Hastings, was mounting. Hastings demanded that the quarantined wolves be burned alive to protect the rest of the pack. Driven by a desperate, agonizing need to say goodbye to his former mentor, Liam descended into the stables an hour before dawn, a silver blade clutched tightly in his hand to do the merciful, unthinkable deed himself. He dismissed the trembling guards at the iron door and stepped into the dim, lantern-lit gloom of the stables. He braced himself for the chorus of agonizing howls and the lunging of maddened beasts. Instead, he found an eerie, reverent silence. Liam walked slowly down the central aisle, his heavy boots making no sound on the damp stone. When he reached old Hemlock's stall, the king froze. The silver dagger slipped an inch in his grip. Curled in the dirty, blood-flecked straw was a young woman in the ragged dress of a scullery maid. She was fast asleep, her breathing deep and even, but that was not what made the Alpha King's heart hammer against his ribs. It was the wolves, 3 of the most dangerously afflicted Lycans, beasts that had torn a stable hand's arm off just a week prior, were piled around her. Old Hemlock's massive scarred head rested heavily on her chest. Lady Beatrice was curled around her legs, and a younger, black-furred wolf young piper, a knight of the realm, had his nose tucked beneath her chin. They were not rabid, they were not thrashing. For the first time in months, they were resting peacefully. The rotting stench of the blight was muted here, replaced by the faint, earthy scent of crushed herbs and petrichor that radiated from the sleeping girl. Liam stood paralyzed. The absolute authority and dominance he wielded as Alpha meant nothing in the face of this impossible scene. He knew the law. Any human caught in the quarantine zone was to be executed instantly to prevent the blight from mutating and spreading. He should have dragged her out by her hair and thrown her to the guards. Instead, Liam did something entirely out of character for the ruthless king of Oakhaven. He slowly sheathed his dagger. He stepped closer, his golden alpha eyes sweeping over her exhausted, dirt-smudged face. He noted the dark circles under her eyes, the thinness of her arms, and the raw, blistered skin on her fingers from grinding herbs. When Hemlock let out a soft, pained whimper in his sleep, the girl, without waking, instinctively raised a hand and stroked the spot behind the old wolf's ears. A faint, almost imperceptible silver glow pulsed from her fingertips, sinking into the wolf's fur. A moonweaver, Liam realized, the breath catching in his throat. The legends were true. He didn't wake her. As the first grey light of dawn crept through the high, barred windows, King Liam turned and silently left the stables, leaving the sleeping maid locked away with his dying kin. The next night, Alice went to the stables expecting the heavy iron doors to be barred, or worse, guarded by the king's elite executioners. But the path was clear. The guards were conspicuously absent from the lower levels. She slipped inside, her heart racing, and went to work. Hemlock's breathing was less laboured today, and the terrible weeping sores on Lady Beatrice's flanks had begun to scab over. Alice ground her herbs, whispered her incantations, and finally, exhausted to her bones, collapsed in the corner stall among the massive bodies of the wolves. When she woke, the pale light of morning was filtering in, and King Liam was sitting on an overturned bucket just outside the stall, watching her. Alice scrambled backward, hitting the stone wall, her heart leaping into her throat. Hemlock let out a low, protective growl, standing between the girl and the king. Liam didn't flinch. He was an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and battle-scarred, wearing a heavy tunic of black leather and the silver circlet of his station. His golden eyes locked onto hers, analyzing, piercing right through her terrified facade. "Do not fear me," Liam said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the damp air. "If I wanted you dead, you would not have woken up." Alice swallowed hard, trying to smooth her torn dress. "Your Grace," she whispered, keeping her eyes cast down. "I mean no treason. I couldn't listen to them cry anymore. What is your name?" "Alice, my lord." Liam leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You carry the old magic, Alice. The Weaver's blood. The council would burn you at the stake for simply breathing the air in Oakhaven. Will you hand me over to them?" she asked, a spark of defiance breaking through her fear. If she was going to die, she wouldn't beg. A faint ghost of a smile touched the king's lips. "They are my pack. My family. The maesters bleed them with leeches and proclaim them dead. You sleep in the muck and pull them back from the brink of the abyss." Liam stood up, pulling a heavy, fur-lined cloak from his own shoulders. He tossed it over the wooden gate of the stall. "It is freezing down here. Use that. I will see you tomorrow morning." And so began the strangest, most dangerous secret in the kingdom of Oakhaven. Every night, Alice would tend to the sick. And every morning, an hour before dawn, the Alpha King would descend into the stables. At first they didn't speak much. Liam would sit in the shadows, simply watching her work. He brought her things: clean linen, rare medicinal herbs from the royal gardens, heavily spiced meats, and fresh water. Alice began to see the man beneath the crown. She saw the heavy burden of leadership in the slump of his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw the profound, heartbreaking gentleness with which this feared warlord would stroke the muzzle of his dying friends. The tension between them shifted from fear to a thick, crackling awareness. One morning, as Alice was struggling to bind a particularly nasty wound on Piper's hind leg, Liam stepped into the stall without a word. He knelt beside her in the dirt. His large, calloused hands gently pushed hers aside. "Guide me," he murmured, his shoulder brushing against hers. Alice's breath hitched. The proximity of the Alpha King was overwhelming. She could smell the pine and smoke of his scent. "Hold the linen tight there, Your Grace," she instructed, her voice trembling slightly. As their hands brushed, a jolt of raw, electric energy snapped between them. Liam's golden eyes snapped up to hers, his pupils dilating. For a long, suffocating moment, neither of them breathed. It was during these quiet, intimate mornings that Alice made a horrifying discovery. "Your Grace," Alice said one morning, her brow furrowed as she sifted through the remnants of the meat that had been brought down for the wolves the night before. "The blight. It is not a sickness. Not a natural one." Liam stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "Explain." Alice held out a piece of raw venison. Crushed into the fibers of the meat was a fine, silvery powder, silver ash and wraith root. "It mimics the symptoms of the blight. It attacks the lichen nervous system, forcing them into their wolf forms and rotting them from the inside out. Someone is not trying to cure your pack, Liam. Someone is systematically poisoning them." The use of his first name slipped out naturally, but neither noticed. Liam took the meat from her hand, his eyes darkening to a furious, molten gold. A low snarl ripped from his chest. "Only the High Council has access to the quarantine feed. Hastings." The political implications hit Liam like a physical blow. Councillor Hastings was plotting a coup. By wiping out Liam's most loyal generals under the guise of a plague, Hastings was clearing the board to usurp the throne. Before Liam could fully process the betrayal, the heavy iron doors of the stable groaned open. Neither Alice nor Liam had noticed the passage of time. The sun was fully up. But it wasn't the royal guard standing in the doorway. It was a contingent of mercenaries, wearing the crest of Duke Morland Hastings's right-hand man. They were armed with heavy crossbows loaded with silver-tipped bolts, and their faces were covered in dark cloth. "The king has gone mad," the lead mercenary shouted, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "He has contracted the blight and consorts with a witch. Burn the stables. Kill the beasts." Liam roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the keep. His bones cracked and shifted as he immediately began to shift, his human flesh tearing away to reveal the massive, midnight black coat of the alpha wolf. But there were too many of them. A volley of silver bolts tore through the air. One grazed Liam's shoulder, sending him crashing into the wooden barriers. Another bolt flew straight toward Alice, who was frozen in horror. Before the silver could pierce her heart, a massive, withered grey blur intercepted it. Old Hemlock, weak and poisoned, threw himself in front of the girl, taking the bolt in his flank with a yelp of agony. "Hemlock!" Alice screamed, dropping to her knees. The mercenaries drew their silver swords, advancing into the stables to finish the slaughter. Liam, bleeding and struggling to maintain his footing against the burning silver in his shoulder, stood between the assassins and Alice, baring his teeth. They were trapped, outmatched, and the straw around them was already beginning to catch fire from a thrown torch. Smoke, thick and acrid, billowed into the vaulted ceilings of the beast keep. The damp straw, usually resistant to spark, had been doused in pitch by the mercenaries. Flames licked up the wooden partitions, casting nightmarish, dancing shadows against the ancient stone walls. Liam was a tempest of teeth and muscle. Despite the burning agony radiating from the silver bolt lodged in his thick shoulder, the Alpha King moved with a terrifying primal velocity. He intercepted a mercenary rushing toward Alice, his massive black jaws clamping down on the man's leather-clad arm. The sickening crunch of bone echoed over the roar of the fire. He tossed the screaming man aside like a broken doll, but two more took his place, their silver-tipped swords slashing viciously. Alice was on her knees in the dirt, her hands frantically pressing against the wound in old Hemlock's flank. The grey wolf's breathing was shallow, his eyes rolling back. The silver bolt had pierced deep, and the corrupted metal was already reacting violently with his lichen blood, turning the veins around the wound a necrotic black. "No, no, no," Alice chanted, her voice breaking. She looked up through the stinging smoke. Liam was bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts. The silver was slowing him down. The Alpha was magnificent, a god of war bathed in firelight, but he was losing. The sheer number of mercenaries, armed with the bane of his kind, was overwhelming him. One of the assassins, a towering brute with the crest of House Morland branded onto his leather breastplate, levelled his heavy crossbow directly at Liam's broad back. Alice felt a snap within her. It was not a break of her spirit, but a shattering of a dam she had built inside herself since childhood. The suppressed, terrified magic she had carefully portioned out in tiny, hidden doses suddenly roared to life, fueled by a desperation that tasted like copper and ash. She refused to watch him die. She refused to let these noble beasts be slaughtered in the dark. Alice closed her eyes and slammed both her palms flat against the blood-soaked earth of the stable floor. She did not reach for the gentle, humming lullabies her mother had taught her. Instead, she reached deep into the ancient, volatile roots of the earth itself, pulling upon the raw, unrefined power of the Moonweaver lineage. The air in the stables violently warped. A concussive wave of pure, blinding silver light erupted from Alice's body, sweeping outward in a brilliant shock wave. It blew the encroaching smoke back, extinguishing the localized flames instantly. When the light washed over Liam, the silver bolt lodged in his shoulder was violently expelled, shooting out of his flesh and clattering onto the stone. The agonizing burn of the metal vanished, replaced by a surge of revitalizing, cool energy. Liam let out a deafening, earth-shattering howl that rattled the iron bars of the cells. But the true miracle was happening in the straw behind him. The silver shockwave crashed over the dying, poisoned wolves. The magic did not just soothe them. It actively hunted the alchemical poison in their veins. The wraith root and silver ash that had paralyzed their nervous systems were purged instantly, evaporating from their pores as a black, foul-smelling mist. Lady Beatrice, the golden-furred northern lady, who had been too weak to lift her head an hour ago, suddenly snapped her eyes open. They were no longer the milky yellow of the rabid, but a clear, furious sapphire. She surged to her feet, her muscles rippling with renewed deadly strength. Young Piper, the Black Knight, let out a vicious snarl, his fangs gleaming in the dim light. Even old Hemlock, the silver bolt pushed from his flank by the healing magic, rose stiffly, his eyes locking onto the mercenaries who had dared to strike him. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted. The mercenaries froze, the colour draining from their faces. They had come to execute dying, crippled animals. Instead, they were facing a fully healed, fiercely loyal pack of royal lycans, led by a revitalized Alpha King and backed by a weaver of terrifying power. "Kill them," Liam commanded, his voice a guttural roar in his alpha form. The royal pack descended. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. Lady Beatrice moved like a golden blur, her jaws locking onto the throat of the man who had shot Liam. Piper and Hemlock flanked the remaining assassins, their coordinated strikes a testament to years of fighting side by side on the battlefield. Within moments, the stables were silent, save for the heavy, victorious panting of the wolves and the crackle of the dying fires. Liam shifted back into his human form. He was naked, covered in soot, blood and sweat, but he paid no mind to his state. He strode across the bloodied floor, ignoring the carnage, his golden eyes fixed solely on Alice. She was slumped against the wooden gate, her energy entirely spent. The silver glow had faded from her skin, leaving her pale and trembling. Liam dropped to his knees before her. He gathered her fragile body into his massive arms, pulling her tightly against his bare, heavily muscled chest. "I have you," Liam whispered fiercely into her hair, his voice vibrating with an emotion he had not felt in centuries. "I have you, Alice. You are safe." Alice leaned into his warmth, her hands clutching his broad shoulders. She could hear the rapid, powerful thud of his heart. "They were trying to silence us," she breathed, her voice raspy from the smoke. "Hastings, he knows the pack is recovering." Liam pulled back just enough to look at her face. He gently wiped a streak of soot from her cheek with his thumb. He sent his hounds to finish the job before the sun rose, which means he intends to make his move today. Behind them, Lady Beatrice shifted back into her human form. She quickly pulled a discarded mercenary's cloak over her shoulders. "Hastings called a full assembly of the High Council at dawn," Beatrice said, her voice sharp and aristocratic, though laced with a new, profound reverence as she looked at Alice. "He plans to declare the Alpha King dead of the Blight, and claim the throne as regent." Liam's eyes darkened, the gold shifting to a dangerous amber. He stood, pulling Alice to her feet beside him. He did not let go of her hand. "Then we must not keep the councillor waiting," Liam said smoothly. He looked at the bodies of his loyal friends, now standing tall and fierce behind him. It is time the dead returned to court. The Great Hall of Oakhaven was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation. Towering pillars of polished black marble reached up toward a ceiling painted with the constellations of the winter sky. At the far end, bathed in the morning light streaming through stained glass windows, sat the obsidian throne. Councillor Hastings stood on the dais before the empty throne. He was a tall, excessively groomed man, wearing robes of deep violet velvet. The great hall was packed with the lords and ladies of the realm, their faces tight with anxiety and grief. "My lords, my ladies," Hastings projected, his voice echoing off the marble. He held a silk handkerchief, occasionally dabbing at his dry eyes in a pantomime of sorrow. It is with a shattered heart that I confirm the darkest of rumours. The Crimson Blight has claimed our beloved King Liam. He succumbed to the madness in the night. The royal guard was forced to cleanse the stables with fire to prevent the spread. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Some wept. Others whispered frantically, calculating the political fallout. In the absence of an heir, Hastings continued, his voice rising in authority, and by the ancient laws of succession, the High Council has nominated me to assume the mantle of Lord Regent until such a time. The massive oak and iron double doors of the Great Hall did not just open, they exploded inward. The heavy wood splintered, the iron hinges groaning in protest as they were violently forced apart. The Great Hall fell into a dead, terrified silence. Standing in the archway was King Liam. He was dressed in the armour he had hastily stripped from the fallen mercenary captain in the keep, dark, unpolished, and stained with fresh blood. His face was smeared with soot, his golden eyes burning with a lethal, unyielding fury. But it was not just the king who silenced the room. Flanking him were the very nobles Hastings had just declared dead. Lady Beatrice, Old Hemlock, and Knight Piper strode into the hall, their heads held high, moving with the predatory grace of apex predators. And at Liam's right hand, her fingers interlaced with his, was a scullery maid in a torn, soot-stained dress. "I find your eulogy lacking, Hastings." Liam's voice boomed, cutting through the silence like an executioner's blade. Hastings visibly recoiled, all the colour draining from his face. "Treason!" he sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at Liam. "An impostor! The king is dead! Guards! Seize them! They are infected!" A dozen heavily armoured guards, loyal to Duke Morland, drew their swords and rushed forward. Liam didn't even draw a weapon. He simply let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in the chests of every lichen in the room. Lady Beatrice and Piper stepped forward, their eyes flashing golden, their teeth bared. The royal guards, realizing they were about to attack legendary warriors thought dead, hesitated, their swords faltering. "Drop your steel, or lose your hands," Liam commanded. The authority in his voice was absolute. The guards, recognizing their true alpha, threw their swords to the marble floor with a clatter. Liam marched down the central aisle, the crowd parting before him like the sea. He stopped at the base of the dais. Hastings scrambled backward, tripping over his velvet robes and falling onto the steps of the throne. "You poisoned my pack," Liam said, his voice dangerously soft now. "You weaponized our grief. You locked my greatest generals in the dark to rot. All for a wooden chair." "Lies," Hastings shrieked, looking frantically toward Duke Morland, who was already trying to discreetly slip toward a side exit. "It was the blight. It is a sickness." Liam stepped aside, pulling Alice forward. The entire court stared at the small, ragged woman who stood unabashedly before the nobility. "There is no crimson blight," Alice spoke. Her voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the silent hall. She reached into the pocket of her apron and threw a heavy, leather-bound book onto the stone steps at Hastings' feet. It was the personal ledger she had recovered from the mercenary captain's body. The affliction was alchemical, a precise mixture of crushed Aconitum napellus, common wolfsbane, laced heavily with purified silver ash and wraithroot. The whispers erupted into an uproar. The lords recognized the ingredients. My father, Lord Reginald Sterling, documented the exact physiological reactions of this compound in his private journals before he was exiled by this very council. Alice continued, her chin held high, the legacy of her disgraced father finally vindicated. It mimics disease, but it is assassination. And this ledger details the exact payments made by Councillor Hastings to the alchemists of the lower ward to mix it into the quarantine feed. Duke Morland was tackled at the doors by Old Hemlock, who pinned the treacherous lord to the ground with a massive boot. Hastings was weeping now, scrambling on his knees. "My king, I beg you, it was Morland's idea. The council is disbanded," Liam interrupted, stepping up the dais. He grabbed Hastings by the collar of his velvet robes and threw him down the steps toward the waiting guards. "Take him to the dungeons. Let him sleep, in the very stalls he intended to be our tombs." As Hastings was dragged away screaming, Liam turned back to the stunned court. He looked at the nobles who had cowered and plotted, and then he looked at Alice, the woman who had sat in the blood and dirt to save them. Liam descended the steps and stood before her. In front of the entire assembly of Oakhaven, the terrifying, ruthless Alpha King dropped to one knee. A collective gasp swept through the hall. Liam took her small, blistered hands in his massive ones and pressed a reverent kiss to her knuckles. "I was a king ruling over a dying kingdom," Liam said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I sought strength in isolation and steel, but true salvation was found in the shadows, armed with nothing but crushed herbs and a weaver's heart." He stood, pulling her flush against him, his arm wrapping protectively around her waist. He turned his fierce, golden gaze to the court. "Alice of House Sterling is no witch, and no servant. She is the saviour of the royal pack. She is the Moonweaver, returned to us. And by the ancient laws of my blood and my soul," Liam looked down into her eyes, the cold warlord completely replaced by a fiercely devoted mate. "She is my chosen queen." Lady Beatrice was the first. She dropped to one knee, bowing her head. Piper followed, then Hemlock. Within seconds, the entirety of the Great Hall was kneeling, a wave of submission and reverence washing over the marble floors. Alice looked up at Liam, tears finally spilling over her lashes, not of fear, but of an overwhelming, profound joy. He smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression, and leaned down to claim her lips. It was a kiss of fire and silver. A promise sealed before gods and men. Alice never returned to the scullery. Crowned beneath the winter moon, the Moonweaver Queen ruled alongside her alpha, their reign marking an era of unprecedented peace and feral devotion. The stables, once a tomb of despair, were transformed into a sanctuary of healing. They proved that true strength lies not merely in the sharpness of one's claws, but in the enduring, quiet courage of a fiercely compassionate heart.